Hi, HR Nation. Welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives from the world's leading global brands. Today, we have a very special guest on the show, a fellow podcaster. I'm joined by Ginny Clarke, who is a career expert, executive recruiter, author, and host of the Fifth Dimensional Leadership Podcast. Welcome to the show, Ginny. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's nice to see you again. I should mention for everyone that your most recent role, you served as the Director of Leadership and Staffing at Google, right? But you've now left to pursue the next dream.
That's right. I'm really excited about it. It was a great 4 years, and now I'm on to the next thing.
Amazing. What a time as well, right? Is anything around the current circumstances we're going through that made you make that decision, or is it just something you've been thinking about for a while, just out of interest?
No, Chris, it's more that, I wrote this book on career management, and my whole thesis there is tap into who you are and what you want, given where you are now. And for me, as I looked back and all the things that I accomplished and who I want to be and who I know myself to be and how I've grown at Google, I said, this is the time. And it's maybe a little counterintuitive. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, but I guess I've always been a bit of a daredevil. So here we go.
There's never a good time. I remember people saying to me, oh, it must be scary when you started the business. And I quit my job when I just bought a house. So I had a big mortgage. I just got married. So I'd spent all my life savings on the house and the wedding. And we just had our first, our daughter. So so everyone else around me, I was a crazy person, as you can imagine. You've just bought a house, you just got married, you just had a daughter, you've got no money because you've just invested it in those two things.
Right.
But I said to my business partner, Shane, this is the time I should do it because now I can't fail.
That's right.
Like
That's
can't
motivation.
fail. Like there's no option but to win. And I can tell you right now, that was all the motivation I ever needed. And here we are 4 years later. So it's never a good time. It doesn't, if you wait for a good time, it will never happen at all.
Right. I like to think I'm guided. And so, it wasn't an impulse. It was pretty thoughtful.
Amazing. So give everyone, before we go any further, tell everyone a little bit more about your background personally and your journey to how you ended up where you are today.
I'll try to make it quick. I have a lot of years of experience, but I won't give you, every single grade in school. But I went to, I'm from Riverside, California. I went to UC Davis to study animal science, graduated in French and linguistics, and became a college recruiter for a couple of years. The cows and the sheep were not working for me. And went to, after a couple of years, moved to Chicago to go to Kellogg at Northwestern University, their business school. Had a great experience there. Decided they offered me a job in admissions because I'd worked in the admissions office on the admissions committee. I said, no, I have to go into business. I spent a number of years in financial services, banking with Chase, JLL, and commercial real estate, prudential real estate investors. But everywhere I worked, I found myself being drawn, volunteering to go on site to interview candidates to bring into the company. And then I had a defining moment in the early 90s. My father died. He had been a prison warden, one of my best friends, my coach. A big cheerleader. He called me every Sunday morning and really inspired me. Was an amazing leader too. So I had two amazing parents, both of whom are now gone, but had continued to inspire me. I looked back when he died and I said, do I love what I'm doing? And I said to myself, no, if I'm really honest, I don't. What have I always loved? And I thought back to the things that I had done that I loved, and it was recruiting. Now I knew that executive recruiting is a far cry from college recruiting.
Yeah.
But I was pretty effective at networking, and I somehow almost instinctively drew upon the relevant competencies versus looking at my experience and saying, executive recruiting is business development, it's execution, it's relationship management, it's these different component parts. And I talked my way into Spencer Stuart, and I was there for 12 years. I co-founded and led their global diversity practice. I worked in the financial officer and financial services practices, and I left to write this book. So I've made this leap before.
So you've got experience there.
Yeah. I left in 2009, believe it or not, early 2009, just as we were going into a recession. And I did my own thing, got the book published, did consulting, coaching, really enjoyed it. I have a son. I had been married. My son is now 24. I wanted to kind of solidify things for him more financially. That entrepreneurial thing can be a little wonky.
Yeah, I know.
And I got him. So I went back to another firm, That firm was sold after a couple of years. So a friend of mine from there invited me to Google to lead their senior level diversity efforts, recruiting efforts. And so I made the move. I had spent my entire career in Chicago, and I made the move back to my home state of California. And that was 4 years ago. And I took over, I was asked to create by our CHRO an internal mobility program for directors and up. So that's probably a group of about 4,000 people. And proudly, we've had about 500 people come through our program with about a 70% retention rate. So, and then I took over a team of recruiters. So I had 3 teams when I left, and loved every minute of it. It was really a great experience.
Wow, what a journey. There's so much to unpack. There's so much to unpack. Just a random question though, because and you'll have a lot of experience and you just made it. What advice would you give to other CHROs or HR executives that are perhaps thinking about leaving and pursuing some of their passions? Because it's quite daunting. I know it. I've been there. You've done it twice now. and in both one during a recession, one during pandemic. So
I haven't thought about that exactly, but yeah, duh.
What advice would you give to them, and what have you learned looking back from the first time you made the leap?
That's a really deep question, because this is so personal. Meaning, you have really got to come clean with any demons, any fears, any anxieties. And I think looking back the last time, I don't think I really saw that the Ginny Clarke brand was enough. I had spent so many years in big companies, and their brand was my brand. And I think that's common. I mean, I think I have my own brand. I'm not a shrinking violet, right? Yeah, you can kind of figure that out. But when you take that leap, there needs to be a deeply felt sense of confidence and assuredness that you are enough. And I have to give credit to Google for, I think, helping me really see that, because I accomplished a lot in a what I'll call a both formidable and esteemed, organization. So now I really, really know, and I have no doubts about the future and the possibilities, and what my core strengths are, how I can touch people, how I can be of service, how I can add value during this really difficult time. So that's what's new, and that I think is what people need to come to grips with. And if you're not ready, that's okay. There's no judgment, but really tap into your heart and get comfortable with who you are as you step out.
Also understand at the same time, you're never going to be completely ready.
No. Yeah. There is an element of uncertainty, but there's a difference between uncertainty and fear, right? So then that's how I feel. I don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I have it in my mind.
Yeah.
I have goals, but I'm not afraid.
Tell everyone a little bit about the book. What was the inspiration behind the book, and who did you write that for?
Yeah, I wrote it for, editors hate hearing this, and publishers, but I wrote it for a really broad audience. Having been at Spencer Stuart for as long as I was, early on, actually, I was uncomfortable because so many people would come to me and say, "You're going to help me find a job." And I'd say, that's actually not what I do. I'm one who likes to set expectations. A lot of recruiters are like, yeah, whatever, but I cared, especially for underrepresented executives. And I thought, if I can lift sort of the methodology of executive recruiting and apply it to how an individual might find work, that can be of service to those people that I can't help. Because, any search firm, the largest firms are only doing, call it 5,000 searches a year, right? And there are literally millions of opportunities. And so I wanted people to stop saying, hey, just tell me what's out there. It's like, whatever you want is out there. You're in the driver's seat. And so it's a really empowering book that's offering a framework. And the through line of it is around competencies. As I mentioned before, I figured out what mine were as I was moving across the different industries and functions that I've served in. And so I wrote it. And at the end of every chapter, I call out for young people, because my son is a recent college grad. He's been out for a couple of years. I wrote it for them. And I have a little call out for, if you're just starting out, someone for mid-level, executive level, people who might be veterans coming back into the workforce. So I really wanted to address some of the nuances, but the core elements are true for everyone.
You had to choose a few of the kind of practical things that you share in the book. What would they be?
Well, the first one is kind of asking yourself, what do you want? I found in working with some of the senior leaders at Google who were in the internal mobility program, they had trouble answering that question, almost regardless of their tenure, because they were so limited in their thinking. It was, well, what are the roles? And I'm like, no, I want you to just pretend. Let's imagine that there's a vacuum and you get to pick. What's your heart's desire? And again, I just don't think people allow themselves to think that. So that's where I start. And then I try to get people into this framework of looking back and taking inventory of all the competencies that you've amassed. And they can be for young people. It could be whatever you did in college, working at a Starbucks. I don't really care what it is, but extract those elements of how you did things and understand those things that spoke to you, and sift and sort and decide which things you don't especially like, and then begin to plot another sort of aspirational course, whatever timeline you decide, that's looking at some of those same elements of what is the industry, what is the function, and you distill it down to the competencies and assess the gaps between where you want to be and what you have already in your inventory.
It sounds so obvious. So why do you think that? And I've struggled with that same question as well. I think most people have. Why don't we do it? Why is it? What is it that we don't think about or don't take into consideration?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons for people. I started speaking about the book in the early days. I spoke at a lot of corporations and would be milling around afterwards talking to people. And what came up from people, they offered that they had a lot of fear, that they were afraid of taking that next step for any number of reasons. One, it could have been imposter syndrome, where they weren't sure that they were good enough. It could have been that they saw behaviors in people at this next level that seemed incongruent with their values. It could be that they come from, an immigrant, or they're the first person in their family to go to college, and they're afraid that if they begin to distance themselves from their family, that there will be discomfort or resentment. So, people are bringing all of their personal baggage into the workplace. You really can't separate out who you are and what you do. So, I say to my son all the time, he's like, well, I don't like this, I don't like that. I'm like, dude, wherever you go, you are. So just remember that, you're not going to get away from the essence of you. And so that's part of the underlying theme is the book is really tap into who you are and get comfortable with that, because that absolutely dictates how you're going to show up and where you're going to land and how successful you're going to be.
At Google, how did you help your employees navigate that journey?
I tried to tap into each one of them. Now, there are boundaries. I'm not a therapist. I'm not going to begin to suggest that, right? But I really did. I gave them feedback.
I'm so obvious. Yeah.
But people don't do it. And, and I have to say, one of the things that I observed, and I think this is true, I've heard it from other people in tech and across companies for that matter. I believe feedback is a gift. It's one of the greatest gifts that you can give to a friend, to a subordinate, to even superiors. And if, for whatever reason, I think to the extent that people don't, one, if they're not comfortable in who they are, back to that, they're not going to be comfortable in offering you that feedback. I've heard as a Black woman, I've heard white men, managers say, I'm uncomfortable giving feedback to underrepresented individuals for fear that they're going to think that I'm being discriminatory or unduly harsh. Okay, fine. But do you understand that by not giving it, you're putting that person at a disadvantage?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think feedback is one of the greatest things that I've offered my team. And as I was leaving Google, I got that feedback from them, that thank you for telling me about the good and the stuff that I really need to work on.
Mm-hmm. And for everyone listening, I could see how much that meant to you before we hit record on this. You mentioned that, and I could see in your face the joy of just getting that feedback. Because sometimes you work with people for years and you just don't know until you're leaving what the relationship meant to them and to each other. And then you have that conversation. I had the same thing when I left. I was at the company for 10 years, and all of a sudden, these people in accounting and marketing and other things that are like started talking to me and sharing all these things. I was like, wow, like I never knew that. We're having this conversation now. I'm leaving.
That's right.
So, yeah, it's very important. What's the most effective way to give feedback in your experience? Because there's good ways of doing it and really bad ways.
Yeah, well, I'm not a fan of the sandwich, right? Where it's,
Mm.
you do this so well. You need to work on this, but you do
You
this
said
so
so.
well.
That's
It's
really,
like,
that's like the old school, really old
that's
school
old
way.
school.
That's what
I'm
I was
sorry.
taught when I first became manager, maybe what, 13 years ago. I remember my manager telling me that's how you do it. Yeah.
I don't like that because people hear what they want to hear, and they're going to anchor on
They see through
the
it.
beginning and
They see
They,
through it as
they
well.
do see
It's like,
through
come
it.
on, it's not authentic. It's just,
Yeah. So I really try to engage people in a conversation and tell them what I've observed because, feedback is subjective. Let's face it. And I think that's part of why people are uncomfortable with it. It's subjective, it's nuanced. And a lot of people who aren't comfortable don't have a lot of EQ,
mhm.
avoid it, which is really unfortunate. So my approach is to just say, hey, listen, this is what I observed in the moment. If something went down, look, I'm really concerned that this didn't go well. And can we talk about why? Do you have an opinion about why this has gone sideways, and how we can solve this problem?
Mhm.
And here's what I've observed over time that I think you need to work on. You do have a tendency to micromanage. So I'll just call out stuff,
Yeah.
and let's fix it. And maybe we get a coach over time if it's not getting better, because I can't be the one. I don't want to keep beating the drum. Let's get to some underlying, what's going on with you? Are you okay? So there's room for empathy and care. But at the same time, my son will tell you, I'm someone who I call stuff out as I see it. It
Yeah.
was hard for him growing up with me, but
Sounds
he turned out really well.
Sounds like my wife. Well, it's good. She's very good at giving me feedback.
Yeah.
It's very empowering, though, right? And also, it kind of depends on the culture of you're in. If you have that the culture of the psychological safety, because I've worked in companies where it was very tough and difficult to give feedback because the culture, it wasn't accepted. And then other cultures, like the culture we have now, my team are very open to give me feedback, both positive and negative. And it's not, we understand, everyone understands that it's not personal, because by not giving the feedback, it's just holding us back as
Precisely.
individuals, as leaders, as a business. And it's so, I can see when people join our team, sometime when they first experience it, they're like, whoa, this junior person who's just joined 2 weeks ago is telling the CEO that you need to do this because this is going to be better. And this is what my thoughts. In other organizations that wouldn't have been accepted because you're the new star, I'm the CEO. And I realized it's probably been one of the most empowering things for me to be vulnerable as a
Sure.
leader and
Yeah.
show my weaknesses and actually talk about it with my team. More recently, over the last few months, has been around kind of my anxiety and depression. I have panic attacks, and I hid that for years because I thought maybe they're going to see me as a less of a leader or a person in general. But I realized actually just humanized them and connected us on a different level that I don't think I've ever had that before.
That's right. And
So
that's something that I talk to people about all the time as it relates to their career. And something I mentioned earlier on, it's like you're bringing yourself to work, whether you realize it or not.
yeah,
And so if you are suffering from anxiety, depression, imposter syndrome, get a therapist. Don't struggle with this. There's no shame in it. My son suffered from that. And I said, listen, let's get you what you need. But I think too, as a leader, it's possible to build sort of microcultures where there is that psychological safety if the leader is actually modeling this healthy behavior, being vulnerable, taking feedback, eliciting feedback, and giving it. And there's a real intimacy, a
yeah.
healthy intimacy that I think can be formed when those relationships are established.
In terms of the executive recruitment area, is as you mentioned, it's definitely a world away from where you started. What were some of the challenges that you faced when you first kind of moved into that executive recruiting role, and advice you'd give to other CHROs out there that are going to obviously be hiring these roles in their
Mhm.
organizations as they grow and scale?
I'll offer the piece about coming in house, right? From having been in an agency
Mm-hmm.
for 12 years at Spencer Stewart, and then another firm for a couple of years after that. The in-house orientation was challenging because a lot of the recruiters who had been identified as part of this internal executive search firm were coming from the general staffing organization. And at Google, we hire over 20,000 people a year. And so those are huge numbers, 4 million applicants. That's a machine. what executive recruiting is, however, as you, I'm sure, understand,
Mm-hmm.
it really is about going after passive candidates. Yes, you might have some applicants for these director plus roles, but our recruiters are expected to do deep research because these are one of a kind roles. If we're hiring 5,000 software engineers, that's one thing. But these are the treasurer, the general counsel, the head of procurement. I mean, it's very often that singular role. And so it's the rigor needed to be there. And it was a little challenging, frankly, to orient our hiring managers around that when they're used to just sort of opening a rec and saying, okay, show me some backgrounds. And one of the things I really stressed was trying to empower the recruiters on my team to become that trusted advisor, meaning, you need to help them understand that we own this process. And this is how the process is going to work. And no, they're not going to see, they can get some calibration backgrounds in the first week or two, but they're not going to see 30 backgrounds, nor should they, because we should be culling it down and showing them only the most relevant, qualified individuals over time. Speed should not be the measure necessarily. Quality, I think, is more important at the leadership level than speed.
Especially in those roles.
Yeah, well, especially in those roles. I mean, I often had to say to some of these hiring managers, look, you just joined 2 years ago. How long did it take for us to recruit you? I literally had one hold up her hand and go, 4 months. I'm like, so why do you expect somebody in 30 days?
That's a good way of putting a question back on them. That's great. Yeah. What's the process look like at Google? We're not asking you to give us the entire detail, but what does that look like in terms of how do you, because obviously everyone knows the brand, everyone knows who Google is, right? But what does the outreach look like for those executives that you're trying to, engage with?
Yeah, it really is similar to a firm, meaning, I've tried to wean the recruiters off of LinkedIn as their sole
LinkedIn messaging all day long.
I'm old school, and that means that people don't pick up the phone as much anymore. That's how I learned.
Which is good because it means it separates. Because I'm old school that way as well, by the way. I pick up the phone and call people, and they're so confused they're getting a call because they're so used.
Well, they don't know the number; they might not answer it.
and also, like, I make sure I personalize it. So when I speak to them, it's like I don't know. I'll do like a whole day's research so I can see. Oh, I saw you just won this award yesterday, or I saw that you posted this. Or no one does that anymore. They just have blanket messages. They just send out.
Yeah. No, it's and so at a minimum, I'm encouraging them. I'm like, go find their email somewhere, right? I mean, we have a database, so go in there and dig it out and send a personalized email to people, because this isn't a game of numbers. But we're not trying to identify 200 people for this role. There might only be 70 in the world who could do this at the scale that we need it. So pick out the top 25 or 30 and go after them and have a rationale for why those people make the most sense. One of the things that I noted, and again, I date myself by saying this, but all the biggest search firms were founded by, Mr. Spencer Stewart, Mr. Russell Reynolds, Mr. Korn, Mr. Ferry. And these guys were management consultants. And one of the reasons I think that the model has stood the test of time is that it was a peer-to-peer relationship, meaning they were management consultants who were working with the CEOs of the company or the senior leadership team. They had access to candidates who were of that same caliber. And so that peer relationship, mind you, it was a men's club, it was a boys' club. But that element of having a very senior level person doing that outreach, making those connections, understanding dynamic business issues, looking at it not just as a transaction, but a relationship. That's the origin of executive search. And I fear that that's lost inside organizations, right? As well as in some of the firms now. I think it's gotten a little bit diluted, which makes me sad.
Super fascinating. Tell us a bit more about sort of learning moments you had during your career at Google. Biggest lessons learned, biggest moments that you're most proud of. What stands out looking back at your career then?
I was initially hired to help with diversity at the leadership level. And I'm really proud that I was able to build an infrastructure that supported improving representation and building, and that included, importantly, as we were just talking about, building relationships with senior underrepresented individuals. Because I think tech in particular, the Valley where I now live, I think I'm moving back to Chicago, but the Silicon Valley is very insular. And I noticed that early on. I was used to going to conferences and moving around and having contacts all over the world. And a lot of these leaders, they've grown up here. Their world people come to them, and they just really were, kind of uncomfortable with the idea of doing any outreach. And we kind of dragged them out in some cases, or at least brought them as far as, Google headquarters and held dinners with groups of Latinx leaders and African American leaders. And so it's things like that over time began to impact. We still have a ways to go. They do. I say we. I'm still feeling very close to to Google. But I think it's part of a mindset that leaders need to have around talent in general. It's not a commodity, especially at the leadership level. You really need to be discerning. You need to know what you want and not just grab an old, tired job description, and match up. And don't just rely on your network, because that's limiting on so many levels. And that was one of the key things that I identified. I'm like, wait a minute, this role opened and closed last week. We never saw it. The hiring manager picked the person from their network. It never even was, never posted, so that external individuals had a shot at it. And so those are some of the things that I'm really proud that I was able to do in shifting the orientation and the mindset, as well as increasing the supply of individuals that we began to interact with. Mm-hmm. And again, the part of that mindset shift is building the relationship. There were a couple of people that we spoke to for 2 and 3 years before we actually were able to hire them.
That's a good point, though. I want to stop you there for a second for everyone listening. Yeah. It takes time. This isn't something you do overnight. Building the relationships and the trust. Before I started this company, I had a small stint at a previous company, and the person who I ended up working with had called me every day for 10 years. Every year for 10 years. Every year he would call me and say, how are you? Enjoying it? You checked in? And then every single year, Costas, if you're listening, and he would remember the last conversation. Yes. And he would say, how is Robin? Or how is that, how are you getting on with your jiu-jitsu or your ice hockey? And I was always amazed. So when I was looking at leaving, of course, who's the first person I called? Right. But as well, so it takes time, and most people just are not willing to put the work in.
But that's what real executive recruiting is, right? Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It's not just doing the transaction. It's building the relationships and knowing who's who, and then, knowing you well enough to say, I think this is a great role for you, where you've established the executive recruiter, have established credibility by really getting to know you and being discerning. I'm not going to waste your time with something that's not right for you.
Mm-hmm. And being
as well as my client. Yeah.
Yeah, because that as well. Because otherwise, unlike many companies you see now, they just leave just as fast as they come in.
That's right.
And we see it, especially in the D&I space as well. Yeah. More so, I'm seeing it because they come into a culture that isn't inclusive. And they're really kind of just going through the motions of ticking the box. And then all of a sudden, I see a month later, that person's no longer there, and it's all very quiet. And
that's right.
It's I'm sure you've seen that as well, right?
I've absolutely seen it, and I work very closely with Google's chief diversity officer to look at the whole life cycle for underrepresented individuals, and it's global. So, Black, Latinx, Native American in the United States, and then globally, it's more about women or people native to their country. In many cases, particularly in APAC. So understanding all of those nuances and those drivers, I think, is really important. But it's not just the hiring, the representation piece. People tend to look at hiring first. Where they should really start looking, I think, is who's already in the company.
Yeah.
And is there parity in the attrition rates, right? And very often there is not. That is a red flag. And what is the progression rates? Is there parity across the scoring for performance evaluations? Those are the things that need to be looked at to ensure that and I cared, right? Because if I'm trying to bring people in, I want to make sure that they are going to be successful. I really say that diversity is in corporate America, in the corporate world, is a leadership issue. It's not a numbers issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's who is setting the bar and the tone for the culture of inclusion. It's not a social movement, right? It really is good business. It's a talent mindset that says we know how to tap in and optimize the talent from all kinds of different people. And we have leaders who can do that. And it just, as you keep coming down layer after layer, it becomes really important that those leaders are held accountable for that. And let me offer one other thing. On my podcast, I had a gentleman named Bill Osborne, who's an SVP at Boeing. And he told me that since the Black Lives Matter movement, Boeing let go of a number of its executives. And I think it was kind of under the radar, but he said they were identified as not being inclusive leaders. And I thought, now that takes guts. Yeah, that's setting a tone, right? That's a loud, bold move that I think more companies should really do. And I think a lot of companies in general I actually think Google's attrition rate overall was a little too low. I'm not sure that there was enough top grading, to use an old business school term, and really being discerning about who's good, better, and best. And if those folks aren't the people who aren't doing well, coach them, give them what they need. But if over time, there's plenty of measures, there are plenty of signals from the performance evaluations, all these other, management feedback surveys. So get rid of them, call the herd. I really feel strongly about that for everyone, right? That's getting rid of bias.
It's true. You see like companies that have two voices. They have one voice where they're kind of playing, they're trying to tick the boxes around D&I. And there's others that, even though those leaders, for example, at Boeing, they're probably maybe very high performers as well, right? Mm-hmm. And great salespeople, head of supply chain, whatever they may be. But it's the real companies that are really invested that say that's not what we're measuring on. Like,
that's right.
if you don't tick these boxes, then you're out. And so it's good to hear that story.
Well, and I do think, and I'll make this point, I don't know that I did, but on following on that theme, I think a lot of the tech companies, because they do tend to over-index on domain expertise, because there's so many, I think Google's like 63, 65% engineers. And so when you're hiring them, the expectation is, we need the best. How many patents, how many PhDs? You guys are genius. We love you. Come in and run this organization. And nobody's really, really carefully assessed their leadership capabilities and competencies. And so there's often a gap that goes unspoken. But that accountability needs to be there from the very top to say, we expect people to perform as leaders, and this is what strong leadership looks like. It's not enough to be brilliant.
We spoke before around how we're kind of reimagining the employee experience journey. How do you how are you seeing this unfold, and how do you see it unfolding moving forward?
I'm pausing because that is such a big question.
Yeah, let's just say from the onboarding experience, right?
Yeah.
Like, if we're on, like, especially now we're onboarding, employees virtually, right? It's the whole,
It's awful. And before I left, I spoke to a number of people that I had helped to bring in, just to check in and see how they were doing. And they were all, as gracious as they could be, but they acknowledged that, they missed just that proximity, just the human interaction to really get a feel. We're sentient beings.
That's kind of brings you together when you meet someone, right? Or you're there and you can see it and you can feel it, you can smell it. It's everything.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And even, the space, Google space was always so interesting and unique and different, and the micro kitchens and, just not even being in the office to begin to get a sense of the vibe. That puts them at a bit of a disadvantage, but it doesn't have to be a death knell, So my advice was always set up virtual coffees with people. There's something called MoMA. It's sort of the company directory. Go in and identify people who might be adjacent to you, because at the leadership level, it's kind of easy. People are they'll respond. They'll give you time. That's really what I'm urging people to do. I, as a leader, made sure that I reached out to my more junior people, to my skip level folks, right? I met with my team of directs. I had 6, but I had a whole team of about 30 something people. And so I made sure that I was reaching out to them, and they knew that they could always put time on my calendar and talk to me about whatever was on their mind. I didn't make any decisions that were going to undermine whatever their manager thought, but I just wanted them to feel like a sense of accessibility, and in some cases reassure them of the path that I thought that they were on. I actually sat in all of the performance evaluation feedback sessions for the entire team, and had my directs lead the conversation. And I would, I'd chime in with some observations, but it gave me great insight into how their manager, my direct, was managing them, and how they were doing. I think that we need to just be a little bit closer to virtually to as many people at different levels as we can be, and forge that relationship, and broaden it out, really kind of spider out,
Yeah.
down, laterally and up in the organization, so that you have your virtual ear to the ground.
You have to be conscious about that now. I make a conscious effort, because unlike the workplace where you have those natural organic moments of the water cooler moments, or at lunch, or just dropping in on a meeting, that no longer, those organic moments don't happen anymore. So I realized during this I have to be very conscious about making an effort to go and drop in on a Zoom call and see how everyone's getting on, or call up that employee that I know lives at home alone and who's isolated, and say, how are you? But more so than maybe others. So it's kind of falling on our leaders and managers now. And it's quite a new thing for leaders and managers to actually tackle whilst they're going through the challenges themselves, to then make sure we check in as well. So I've kind of scheduled little notifications to myself just to check in on people, because I know that I'm not going to bump into them at a water cooler or in a kitchen or at coffee or so. And that's something that's really missing.
It's got to be intentional. And for young people, especially, who ask me, because as I said, I used to speak to a lot of them in different sessions, and they'd say, well, how should I continue to grow and be seen and advance during this time? And I said, make a list of people that you want to get to know or spend more time with, and be very intentional, and reach out and touch those folks at least once a quarter. And you're not asking for anything. You send them an article. It's just, be thoughtful and
pay worried about not getting a reply, aren't they?
Yeah, right. They are. Yeah, and move on to the next one. If you don't get a reply, that's okay. You're not being rejected. Move on. The company has 132,000 people.
Yeah, you're a perfect example. And every single guest that's ever been on the show, I've reached out to them and checked in and said, how are you? Love to chat. And I would say 90% I don't get a reply. But that's okay. That's fine. I don't hold it against anyone. But and obviously, as the brand of HR leaders grows, my reply rate gets a lot higher. But when I started, no one replied to me because they didn't know who I was, right? And now it's different. But that seems like a very normal process for me. And I think people are so worried about not getting a reply, and they think too much into that. But others, I spoke to a guy recently called Vern, and he's an incredible guy. Kind of paid his way through university, and I built one of the first ever mobile banking apps, scratch. Right, it wasn't even his job; he did it in his spare time. He's one of those people that are like, you always feel like you're underachieving when you're around him.
Just driven.
Yeah, exactly. And he, I can't remember what book it was. There was a book. It was like an entrepreneurial book that he read, and he sent a copy of the book with a personalized message to all of the co-founders of like Google, Facebook, Airbnb, all the people that inspired him. And literally 6 months later, the co-founder of Airbnb was an investor in his business, and he flew him out to California, jumped on a plane, and they're building this organization together. And that's just an example of what you're saying, where no one else came back to him, but exactly.
All it takes is one.
Yeah, all it takes is one, and now he's now building his dream. And just so you know, it's a diversity and inclusion platform that allows companies to reach diverse community all over the world, and through online job fairs. So rather than kind of where you're traveling all over the world to these physical job fairs, he's done a virtual one. So which is incredible. I've done a pretty bad job of explaining that. I'm sorry, Vern, but you can.
No, I understood. I was tracking with you.
Yeah. So he allows companies to kind of reach different communities all over the world as well. So
So cool.
And as you can imagine right
Passion can
now,
be the driver, right?
exactly. But just buying 10 copies of that book, taking the time to write that message and sending it out. It's incredible what you can achieve. Tell us about the show, about the podcast.
Fifth dimensional leadership. Yeah, that was not
What's
on my
fifth dimensional
radar.
leadership though? Tell us about the name actually.
Oh, the name. Well, I'm someone, I meditate daily. I'm big into the spiritual realm and metaphysics and, sort of the law of attraction. And I have five dimensions that I associate. They're, sort of the fifth dimension in metaphysics. But my five dimensions are know yourself, speak your truth, inspire love, activate mastery, and expand your consciousness. And those are elements that I have discerned, excuse me, are integral to great leadership and to, as I said before, knowing yourself, being really true to who you are at a really deep level. I always think of Steve Jobs. He had his issues, but I think he was tapped into something and was downloading and a lot of that genius. That's what geniuses are doing. They are able to transcend cognition to tap into something that's bigger than them. And so that's sort of a nod that I'm offering in my podcast. I had one of the speaking engagements I had within Google was to some women last year in our Austin office. And during the Q&A, one of the women stood up and said, "When are you going to do a podcast?" And I said, "When you help me produce it." And she did. She and a couple of other women, starting in January, we met every Sunday for an hour and we just ideated and came up with, we had a completely different name, but we pivoted and massaged it. And it's been so gratifying to get leaders' voices and for me to have a voice that I can share about what I've learned about leadership over, 30 plus years of experience. So
Amazing.
I just had Susan Rice, Ambassador Susan Rice from the Obama administration and many administrations. So that was a real honor. And then I've just had some amazing leaders from not-for-profits and from, all different aspects. I had Gautam Chopra, Deepak Chopra's son, talking about sports. So it's just a wonderful platform that I'm thrilled to be able to work on.
And for everyone, make sure you go and check it out. There's going to be a link in the description on the podcast to go check it out there. Isn't it cool that you kind of get to spend time with the people that you're interested the most and to share their knowledge and experience? It's such a cool feel like, Chris, what do you love about what you do? I'm like, I just get to, 1 week I'm listening to a TED talk and the next week I have that person on the show and I'm just get to ask all of those questions that I was off the back of that. Like it's the coolest job in the world. But also it means so much like when that we get to impact, millions of people around the world. And obviously the HR executives that listen to this, the millions of employees that will be affected by some of the changes that they make. As well.
It's my gift to the world, right? To the extent that somebody can learn something and be inspired and begin to believe that they too can achieve some of these things. That's what I'm going for.
Yeah. So I'm guessing you're continuing it now.
I am. Yeah. I have a little more time to devote to it.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, if there's sort of, we've covered quite a lot of different things throughout the last hour. I can't believe an hour's flown by that quickly, actually. As well, if there's sort of parting piece of advice you'd give to other professionals out there, obviously our audience is predominantly HR executives out there. What would that be? And then where can people connect with you if they want to say hello, reach out? Where's the best place for them to reach you?
Sure. In terms of maybe an inspiring word during a difficult time, it's I really would say be kind to yourselves right now as leaders. You probably feel like you're carrying the weight of the world, but be kind. That's part of the message that I offered to my team. I just had a virtual offsite a couple of weeks ago with my leads. And part of what I talked about was this whole idea of doing less and being more and, slow down some of the activity so that you can be still and tap into sort of that inner voice for inspiration and for restoration. Because this is an insidious set of circumstances. The pandemic has put pressure on us that we can't even feel. And it weakens our immune system and it weakens our spirit. And so we've got to fortify. So please be kind to yourselves and you'll come out stronger for those that you care most about. In terms of getting in touch with me, my website is Ginny, Ginny, Clarke, ginnyclarke.com, and you can reach me at ginnyclarke.com or on LinkedIn. And so I welcome connecting with people, because that's what we're all in this to do. It's to connect and share and fortify and hopefully bring light and purpose and goodness back into the world. We all need it right now. And I think we're at a really important roles to be able to do that, because it's all about people, and that's what we do.
Amazing. And for the podcast, for everyone listening, is anywhere you can listen to a podcast, it's there.
It's there. Spotify, Pandora, Google Play, Apple, all that. It's there.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. It means a lot. And even though we've only known each other for a few weeks, I feel like I've known you for a long time.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
I love your energy. I love the work that you do. And I'm super excited for you in this next chapter of your life. So we'll definitely be following your journey over the next few months. You've got a new subscriber in me.
Yeah.
As well. And for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in as always. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Bye for now, Ginny. All the best.
Thanks, Chris.